did the do-nots of the 10 commandments, no murder, no adultery, no lying, no one dishonoring their parents, that would be heaven on earth. You see, that's what God's word does. That's his commandments. But you see, the Bible doesn't just give you all the things you should not do. It also tells you how you should live your life, what you should do to enjoy your life to the full, to the glory of God. He doesn't just tell you what not to do. He tells you what to do in the right way. And that's the key idea of Proverbs chapter 5. You see, again, the father wisely warns his son about do not fall into sexual immorality. Beware of adultery. But then he gives his son a positive, healthy battle plan about how to fight sexual sin by enjoying his sex life in the context of marriage. He says that's the right way to do it. There is the healthy way. Now, the principle here is simply this, but it's so profound. Some people try to deal with their sexual sins or their temptations by trying very hard not to think about it. Okay, remember, don't think about it. Stop thinking about it. Stop thinking about it. Stop thinking. And what happens is the more you try to not think about it, guess what? The more you think about it. If I ask you, do not think about a pink elephant right now. Stop it. How many of you have just thought about a pink elephant? You see, you can't control it. It's just, the principle is this, right? You cannot stop thinking about something by trying to stop thinking about something. The way to stop is to replace it with something else. So if I say, think about a beautiful, gorgeous sunset at the sea, the pink elephant is gone. Okay, now it's back, but temporarily. Okay? But that's the principle. And what Solomon is doing here is so beautiful. He says, why will you think about other women when you have your wife? It's so simple. Like, redirect your thoughts to what you already have. And ultimately, you might sit here and say, even if you are single, this is still the principle that applies to you as a single person is, don't just try and stop thinking about what you should not do. Think about the Lord. Think about truth. Set your minds on things that are above, where Christ is. You see, so by positively putting your affections and your attention on Christ, that's how you deal with your temptations as well. So remember, this is a part 2 of this chapter to chapter 7 about sexual wisdom. Last time we looked at 2 points. We looked at the temptation of lust and the temptation of sexual sins. We looked at the consequences. But today we're only going to focus on the strategies. The strategies. That's the third point, is what strategies may we employ from these chapters to fight the sin. So there's both a horizontal strategy, but then there's also a vertical strategy. So that's the 2 sub-points under the third point. So let's first look at the horizontal strategies that God has given us in this chapter. And the first thing the Bible says is to avoid. Avoid sexual sins. Avoid temptation. Look at chapter 5, verse 8 with me again. So what does Solomon say? He says, keep your way far from her, and do not go near the door of her house. We have seen what the young fool in Proverbs 7, that he has done the opposite of that. Look at chapter 7, verse 6 with me. Look at chapter 7, verse 6. So he says, for at the window of my house I've looked out through my lattice, and I have seen among the simple, I've perceived among the youths, a young man lacking sense, passing along the street near her corner, taking the road to her house. So the Bible just consistently shows us that the key way to fight the sin is not to fight it at all, but to run away from it. The problem is when we try to say, okay, I think I'm strong enough, I can engage the sin, I'm going to enter this temptation willingly. That's the losing battle plan. The best plan is to run. The best plan is to be a coward and flee. And behind that idea of running away from sexual sins and sexual temptation is the very basic truth we all must embrace. We are all capable of this sin. All of us. The first step to truly avoiding the place and the time to fall into the sin is to really believe that you are not as strong as you think you are. This is how the sin usually gets a foothold in our lives. It starts with the thought that it's not really that big of a problem for us. And because you think it's not something you would ever do, you put yourself in the very place to fall into the sin. And we all know the warning of 1 Corinthians 10 verse 12. What does it say? It says, "Let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed lest he falls." Memorize these kind of verses to give you a sober mind when you are in those situations. And I wonder, how long do you think it will take for you to memorize the following verse? Flee sexual immorality. That's a verse. How many of you have just memorized that verse? But it's like little grenades that you can throw at this temptation. Like, don't see how close you can get to it. Flee, run, and pray and ask God the Holy Spirit to bring these kind of verses, these truths, up in your mind at the moment of temptation. So practically, how does this look like practically? Wisdom will require you not to be alone with someone of the opposite sex for extended periods of time. You make sure that even if you are, you make sure that you are in public or that it's easily accessible areas. Your door is never closed. You walk in the light by telling others. Now, I'm not saying that simply being alone with someone of the opposite sex, you have already sinned, or that your only option is to sin when you are alone with someone. That's not what I'm saying. All I'm saying is don't willingly enter into those things and seek it out and think that's okay. No. Sometimes our circumstances are just such that you can't avoid that. You can't avoid being alone with someone of the opposite sex. Sometimes your work requires you to do that. But the idea is just be vigilant. Just be aware. Be ready to run. Like Joseph, right? Just be ready to flee. To avoid the sin would also include avoiding things that triggers you and lead you into the sin. Sometimes it's neutral stuff that you know triggers you and leads you into sexual immorality. So think again about what you are watching, what you are listening to, what kind of games you are playing. Some of these things are a way that leads us into the sin. But another simple aspect of avoidance is found in chapter 7, verse 9. Look at chapter 7, verse 9. It says, "In the twilight, in the evening, at the time of night and darkness." We should not just avoid the places where we are tempted, we should especially avoid also the time when we are falling into sin. Sexual immorality needs three things of you to be able to fall into it. It needs a time, it needs a place, and it needs a desire within your heart. If those three things come together, you have the time, you have the place, and you have the desire, and then you choose that desire, that's when you fall into the sin. So one practical way to just cut the sin and to help your heart to recover is to minimize the time and the places that you tend to fall into the sin. And so practically, you have to study yourself. You have to know yourself. When are you most tempted with sexual immorality? Is it when you're alone? Is it in the mornings? Is it at evening? When you are resting? When you are at work? When you are home? Know the times the sin tends to appeal to you and then seek just to avoid that. Like David, don't slouch around on the couch while you are supposed to be on the battlefield. We sin because we're just not busy enough. You're wasting your time, you are bored late at night, and that's sometimes the time and the place that you sin. So be vigilant, work, be diligent in your callings. When you have to sleep, sleep. When you are in a situation, ask someone into your life, brother, check in on me, sister, check in on me. I know I'm going into a difficult time, a difficult season, difficult place. But to avoid is not the only strategy we have. Here's the second horizontal strategy. Yes, we need to avoid, but here's the positive side. Solomon says, pursue your spouse. Pursue your wife. Solomon wisely says, listen, why are you looking outside of your marriage, which you already have within your marriage? Why are you looking for something you already have? Look at how he counsels his son in verse 15. Okay, now chapter 5 again. So back to chapter 5, verse 15. He says, drink water from your own cistern, flowing water from your own well. Here the analogy is this, okay? The well or the cistern refers to his wife, and drinking or the water refers to sexual relations with. Is sexual or not? Just glance down to verse 18 and 19. Let your fountain be blessed. Rejoice in the wife of youth, a lovely deer, a graceful doe. Let her breast fill you at all times with delight. Be intoxicated always in her love. Now, I know when we hear that, some of us have to check the cover. Is this the Holy Bible? Okay, this is just the Bible. Where's the holy part in it? But this is important, right? This is for it. He wants married couples to enjoy it to the glory of God. In obedience, sex can be an act of worship. And if you're uncomfortable with that thought, you're not thinking biblically. Solomon is saying, listen, you don't need to drink from other sources when you already have a well at home. Think of a well. It is a source of constant refreshment. It is a fixed and permanent thing. In the ancient world, every house had their own well. You don't need to go outside your home to have a drink. So Solomon asks a very logical question in verses 16 to 17. He says, should your springs be scattered abroad, streams of water in the streets, let them be for yourself alone and not for strangers with you. Now, some commentators take the word water here as children or offspring, but I think it's simplest to keep the analogy the same. So if the wife is the well, then water refers to sexual fulfillment. So what Solomon is saying, why would your water, your desire for sexual fulfillment, be spread in the streets if you can have fulfillment at your house? So I think that's the way to interpret this. And I think this picture should stick into your mind. Sexual immorality is like drinking water from the streets, trying to lap up water with your tongue from sewage water because you are thirsty. This is the picture should be in your mind. That's what you are doing. Sure, you are drinking, but it's not the real thing. It's a fake. It's a counterfeit. It's dangerously unhealthy. But the water from your own home is like a well, water purified. If you drink, you are not going to be sick. You'll be refreshed and your relationship will be strengthened. Children in the context of that marriage are blessed and happy with a strong marriage. And Solomon promotes here for an exclusive relationship with his wife. In verse 17, he says, let them be for yourself alone and not for strangers with you. That's always been the ideal, one man and one woman for life. Even though people practice polygamy in the Old Testament, that was never God's intention. He did not create Adam and Eve's, plural. It was Adam and Eve. From the beginning, only one man, one woman. That was God's original design. And sadly, we see the world finds this idea as boring. Like, how could one man or one woman ever be enough? Is that not a form of prison? How could sex ever be fulfilling with only one person? Ironically, no. Practice makes perfect. Okay? And because you are in a covenant relationship, you are safe. Because the very nature of sex is to be vulnerable. It is to be known. It is the deepest possible way of knowing another human being. This is the Bible's view of sex in Genesis 4 verse 1. If you have ever read Genesis, you have read it before. But what does it say? Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived. So the Bible seems like, what is this knowing? What is this? This is not like a Q&A, finding out information about his wife. No, but this is what the Bible portrays sex is like. It is much, much more than just an act. It is to know someone. And if it is ever reduced to just an act, it loses all of its deepest joys, its deepest pleasures. In marriage, in a covenant where we say, no matter what, no matter if you are sick or healthy, rich or poor, whether we find that if we find out after marriage that we are not compatible, and by the way, no one is ultimately compatible. There's two sinners in a marriage, okay? There's going to be incompatibility with two people sinning against each other. But whatever happens, I promise I will never leave you nor forsake you. I've covenanted myself to you. I've promised, I've made a vow to God. And only in that context can sex only be fully enjoyed. And Solomon makes sure that his son doesn't miss it. You can imagine Solomon talking to his son, my son, drink water. It's like, okay, Father, but how will water help me to stay away from the adulteress? How can water help me to not fall into sexual sin? Almost like the disciples misunderstanding Jesus when Jesus says, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, and they think he's speaking of literal bread. And Solomon says, okay, now let me clarify. Verse 18, let your fountain be blessed and rejoice in the wife of your youth, a lovely deer, a graceful doe. Let her breasts fill you at all times with delight. Be intoxicated always in her love. Think about how amazing these words are. God wants you to enjoy your sex life. He wants to bless your marriage. In the context of marriage, sex deepens your friendship, sweetens your relationship, bonds you together as two people. But you will feel cheap, used, and worthless if you use this powerful gift and scatter it abroad for many people. That's just not how it was supposed to be enjoyed. But God says, let your fountain be blessed, rejoice in the wife of your youth. Now that hints at something. The idea is this, that even though you might have married young, the wife of your youth, it's such a beautiful statement for me, but even though you've married young, that doesn't mean that your marriage will automatically be blessed and automatically be happy if you just let it go. No, the idea is you have to cultivate this marriage. You have to actively rejoice in the wife of your youth. Like a garden, if you let it go, it will not stay beautiful. It will not stay lovely. And Solomon calls his son to delight in his wife and in her body. Now, when he calls her a lovely deer, a graceful doe, some compliments are best left in the biblical world. Okay? A doe is a mountain she-goat. So I want you to imagine, oh, my love, you are as beautiful as a mountain she-goat. And just like, okay, that's not very flattering in our modern ears. But remember, in the ancient culture, a doe was considered beautiful. It was considered a graceful animal, wonderful, lovely to look at. He says, that is your wife. She is beautiful. She's lovely. Now rejoice in her. I wonder, did you see the word intoxicated? It says, be intoxicated in a love. Now, you will love what this word means. This word, intoxicate, literally means to stagger, to be drunk, to be led astray, to struggle to walk. So see someone, you know when someone walking down the street who had too many drinks like that, like he doesn't walk straight. That's how you should be with your wife. That's how you should be that's how enjoyable your sex life should be. Drunkenness is forbidden in the Bible, but here it is commanded. God commands you to be drunk in the love of your wife and your husband. Wait, Pastor. It almost seems like you can just do this just for fun. No. Don't you know the 11th commandment? You shall have no joy in your life. Okay. Here, these are one of the strongest. You do get people that believe sex is purely for procreation, nothing else. And you should take them to these verses. No, God commands us to just do it for fun. Enjoy it. Just have fun. Now, so the idea here is this. The best defense against sexual immorality is a strong and healthy marriage. Paul follows that exact same logic in 1 Corinthians 7. I'm just going to read this to you. Listen to 1 Corinthians 7, verse 1 to 5. Paul says, now considering the matters about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman, but because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal writes, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Look at this. This is a beautiful verse. He says, do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer, but then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Do you hear? Paul says exactly the same thing that Solomon says. One way to fight sexual sins is to actively pursue your marriage. Notice again, Paul commands us. God himself commands us. Do not deprive one another. That's one of the saddest sinful tendencies in some marriages. Abstaining as a way to get revenge, as a way to give payback, as a way to blackmail, which that is off limits for a Christian. That is not how we think. But by the way, this is for both husband and wife. Right? Neither has authority over their own bodies, but the other one does. Again, husbands can do the same thing. They can withhold their emotional connection to their wives that wives often long for in physical intimacy. But then Paul writes this surprising counsel in the same chapter. Listen to 1 Corinthians 7, verse 8 to 9. 1 Corinthians 7, 8 to 9 it says, to the unmarried and the widows I say that it is good for them to remain single as I am, but if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. That's probably not what I would have written. If I had to write, if you're struggling in your relationship, if you're burning with passion, if you cannot exercise self-control, be filled with the Holy Spirit and exercise self-control, you sinner. That's what I would have written. But that's not what Paul writes. He says, no, if you cannot exercise self-control, get married. It's like there's natural, normal, God-given desires for physical intimacy, and that should be the signal that you shouldn't pause. You shouldn't wait. You should go. Let that be the green light from God to don't delay. Do not delay. To get married ASAP with a good wife or a good husband, okay? Not anybody. But that's what Paul says. This is normal. This is good. It's not wrong to desire these things. And by the way, I just want to clarify something very important. All of this never means that you can blame your husband or your wife for your own sexual sins. That is also a sick thing to do. There is absolutely zero reason to sin at all. What some people would say, but if you just did, or if you just gave more, if you just were more available, I would never have. Wrong, sinful. We cannot say those words. But the Bible does say it's a lot easier. So again, there's this nuanced truth. We cannot blame our spouse for our own sins. And God says, do not deprive one another lest you be tempted because of your lack of self-control. So we should protect this. Now, I want to apply this to wives, and then I want to apply this to husbands. For wives, I want you to look at Proverbs 7 with me quickly, again, and take what the forbidden woman does and implement this in your marriage. Look at 7 verse 13, Proverbs 7 verse 13 to 18. She seizes him and kisses him, and with bold face she says to him, I had to offer sacrifices, and today I have paid my vows. So now I have come out to meet you, to seek you eagerly, and I have found you. I've spread my couch with coverings, colored linens from Egyptian linen. I've perfumed my bed with myrrh, aloes, and cinnamon. Come, let us take our fill of love till morning. Let us delight ourselves with love. The reason these words are a warning is because of the person who's saying it to which person. Remember, what is wrong with these words is she's not saying these words to her husband. She's saying these words to someone that's not her husband. But if these words were spoken to her husband, it would have been perfectly good, perfectly right. And I think wives, you can take, why is this so appealing for men when they read these things to know this is actually the temptation? Is because God has made us physically wired. when a man is pursued physically, there's just something so beautiful about that. So wives, are you pursuing your husband physically? Do you from time to time surprise him? Of course, sometimes it's reversed. Sometimes the wife has a stronger desire than men, and I just feel that's an answered prayer request. But that's okay, that's for another sermon. But the norm is often men desire more physical intimacy, and therefore it takes more intentional work from a wife to cultivate this area of her marriage. Let your husband feel, why would I ever want someone else? Why would I be intoxicated with another woman if I'm intoxicated with my wife? The idea is like, some of you would know if you have been at a wedding or an all-you-can-eat buffet, and you have eaten so much, and then someone brings to you pudding at the end, and you're like, sorry guys, I can't taste one more thing. It's too much. That's how a husband should try to feel. Okay, try to make your husband feel like that. The idea is to match your husband's desire as best as you can. And that just might be a conversation to talk to your husband. So that's for the wives, but for the men, I want to say this to the men. Let's go back to chapter 5, verse 18, to apply it for the men. Chapter 5, verse 18. Let your fountain be blessed, and look at this, rejoice in the wife of your youth. Notice he doesn't say, rejoice in her body parts. It says, rejoice in her. Want her, not just her body. Sex is like that light on the dashboard of a car, that if it's flashing, it's burning. Something's wrong under the hood. There's something, and some men just break the light and say, problem solved. Okay, it's not shining anymore. But no, like that light shows you there's something wrong underneath. And that's how sex is in marriage. When there's problems there, it's a sign that often there's something else wrong. Maybe there's a lack of communication. Or maybe there's just harshness or unforgiveness or bitterness. So that should be like a reminder or a warning that, okay, something else might be wrong in our relationship. And that's the idea. Men need to know this, that this is to be enjoyed as part of a whole relationship. Sadly, a temptation for men is to be only friendly when they have the desire. Suddenly, wow, the dishes are washed, right? And there's a lot of energy. But then the wife can look through that and say, but I know what you're trying to do. And that should not be what we do. We should be like that always. Man, this might be an important conversation to have with your wife. How are we doing in our marriage? Where can I do better? As men want to be pursued physically, generally speaking, women wants to be pursued romantically. Or a woman wants to be romanced. And men make this mistake, and I've made this mistake myself, to equate doing good things for my wife as the same thing as romancing her. But I'm working hard. I'm doing everything I can to provide. I've changed the diaper. I've washed the dishes. Isn't that enough? I'm thankful for those things, but you're not pursuing me, the person. We don't have time together. Now, I think there are some problems with the book, The 5 Love Languages, but I still think it's a valuable concept for us to know that when you think of 5 love languages, to think about the whole ways we can communicate love to one another. It's not just one way, especially for most women, especially later, is quality time. Spending time with her, listening to her. So for men, beware of thinking that you are a good husband because you do all the things for her, but not with her. Rejoice in the wife of your youth, in her. But notice also a very important observation in the next verses. I want to read again verse 19 and contrast that with verse 20. When he says, be intoxicated always in her love. And then the next question is verse 20. Why should you be intoxicated, my son, with the forbidden woman? So the problem is not to want to be intoxicated. He says, be intoxicated with her. Don't be intoxicated with other women. And the idea is this. Here is a massive observation is, Solomon says you can choose where you are going to set your heart on. You can choose where your love will be, where your affections will be. This refutes a very common idea of love. In the world's sense, what is love? Love is something that happens to you. You are just passive. You are just a victim of love. You have no control over what's happening to you when you love. Love is in no way something you choose. How can you choose to love? That's not what love is. But Solomon says, no, you can choose. You can choose where you are going to set your affections on. Choose your wife again. Set your affections on her again. The same with the wives. Choose your husband again. Respect him. Don't compare him with other men and how badly he's doing with other men. Choose him again and again and again. Respect and honor him as your husband. The idea is stop thinking of the pink elephant of adultery and other men and other women and think of the gift that God has given you. And here I think a very